Fulton County hit the hardest with voting problems yesterday, part of it attributed to poll worker training and logistical issues complicated by the pandemic. An investigation already launched in that county over allegations of absentee ballot applications being mishandled. Thousands of voters reportedly never received their ballots. The investigation is now being expanded to address the major issues we saw during the primary, leading to all of these long lines. Both the Secretary of State and the Speaker of the Georgia House vowing to investigate Fulton County's problems, as well as DeKalb County's problems, calling them, quote, unacceptable. Election officials now vowing to train poll workers more thoroughly on the new machines before the next election.